The morning of October 9th began like any other Tuesday in Elena Hartfield's life, except for the electric current of anticipation humming beneath her skin. She woke at 6:15, exactly as she had for the past 7 years, to the sound of the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen below. Greg was already up, probably scrolling through his phone at the breakfast table, still in his wrinkled pajama pants. The autumn light filtered through the curtains in thin golden strips, casting shadows across the bedroom walls covered in cream-colored paint that had started to peel near the ceiling corners. She'd been meaning to fix that for months. Elena showered quickly, the water never quite hot enough in their old house on Maple Ridge, a street lined with oak trees that had begun to shed their leaves in drifts of burnt orange and rust. She chose her navy blazer, the one with the slight moth hole near the left pocket that she always covered with her hand during meetings. Professional but approachable, confident but not threatening. She'd learned that balance over 7 years at Brennan & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm tucked into a concrete building downtown that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and toner cartridge. Today was the day. Mr. Brennan had hinted at it last week, that slight nod he gave her when she finished the quarterly report ahead of schedule, under budget, error-free, senior account manager, a title, a raise, validation that every late night, every skipped lunch, every weekend spent double-checking spreadsheets while Greg watched football in the next room, had meant something. She came downstairs, heels clicking against the hardwood they'd installed together 3 summers ago, back when they still did things together. Greg didn't look up from his phone. His coffee sat cooling in the chipped mug she'd bought him on their honeymoon in Portland, the one with the lighthouse painted on the side. She poured herself a cup, added cream, watched it swirl and cloud. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower from someone's yard down the street. "Big day," she said, trying to inject lightness into her voice. Greg responded. Not even a glance. She kissed the top of his head anyway. His hair smelled like yesterday's shampoo and sleep. He didn't lean into it. Didn't pull away either. Just sat there. Thumb scrolling. She told herself it was stress. He'd been distant for weeks now, maybe months if she was honest. Coming home later, showering as soon as he walked in the door, keeping his phone face down on every surface. But today wasn't the day to think about that. Today was her day. The drive downtown took 23 minutes. She knew because she'd timed it hundreds of times, knew which lights to catch, which lane moved fastest, where the road dipped and made her stomach lift slightly if she hit it at the right speed. The radio played something generic and upbeat. She didn't really hear it. Her mind was already in Mr. Brennan's office, already hearing the words, already planning how she'd tell Greg tonight over dinner. Maybe open that bottle of wine they'd been saving. Brennan & Associates occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a building that had once been a department store. The elevator always smelled faintly of wet carpet and someone's overly sweet perfume. Elena wrote it up with 2 people from HR she recognized, but didn't know by name. They talked about a television show. She smiled politely and stared at the numbers lighting up one by one. Her desk was by the window. A small mercy. She could see the street below, the people moving like ants. The bus stop where a woman in a red coat stood checking her watch. Elena set down her bag, turned on her computer, straightened the small succulent plant that was somehow still alive despite her neglect. The office buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Keyboards clacking, phones ringing, someone laughing too loud near the break room. At 9:47, Mr. Brennan's assistant appeared beside her desk. Jessica, young, wearing too much mascara, perpetually nervous. "Mr. Brennan would like to see you," she said, voice tight. Elena's heart kicked against her ribs. This was it. She followed Jessica down the hallway, past the conference room with its long table and dying ficus tree, past the water cooler, past Doug from sales, who gave her a strange look she couldn't quite read. The door to Brennan's office was already open. He didn't ask her to sit. That should have been the first sign. "Elena," he began, and his voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news but want to pretend they're not. "I'm going to be direct because I respect you too much to dance around this." The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. She could see the clock on the wall behind him, second hand ticking in perfect, relentless rhythm. The firm is restructuring. Budget cuts from corporate. We're letting go of several positions across multiple departments." He paused, looked down at his desk, at a folder with her name on it. "Effective immediately. We're going to have to let you go." The words didn't land at first. They hovered in the air between them, strange and impossible. Let you go. Such a soft phrase for something so brutal. "I don't understand," she heard herself say, voice distant, like it belonged to someone else. "The promotion, you said—" "I'm sorry, Elena, truly. This comes from above me. Your severance package is outlined here." He slid the folder across the desk. "You've been a valued member of this team." Valued. Past tense. Already gone. Jessica appeared again, hovering in the doorway like a ghost. Someone would escort her back to her desk. She could collect her personal items. Security protocol. As if she might steal something. As if she might break down and cause a scene. She didn't remember walking back to her desk. Didn't remember packing the framed photo of her and Greg from 2 years ago at the lake. The coffee mug that said, "Accountants do it with double entries," that someone had given her as a joke. Around her the office continued. People typed. Phones rang. No one looked at her directly. By 10:32 she was standing in the parking lot. Cardboard box in her arms, staring at her car like she'd never seen it before. The October sun was too bright. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching herself from a great distance. She set the box in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and just sat there for a long time, hands on the steering wheel. Not crying, not moving, just breathing. The drive home was automatic. Muscle memory. She didn't remember choosing to go there, but suddenly she was pulling into the driveway of the house on Maple Ridge, the house with the peeling paint and the lawn that needed mowing. Greg's car was still there, parked at an angle like he'd been in a hurry. He was home. That was good. She needed him, needed to be held, to be told it would be okay, that they'd figure it out together. She grabbed her bag, left the box in the trunk for later, walked to the front door on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The house was too quiet when Elena opened the front door. Not the comfortable silence of an empty home, but something else, something charged and waiting. She stood in the entryway for a moment, key still in her hand, listening. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked its steady rhythm. Somewhere water dripped from a faucet that had needed fixing for weeks. And then she heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Light and musical, drifting down from upstairs like smoke. Her first thought was television. Greg must have taken a sick day. Must be upstairs watching something. But her car pulling in had been loud enough. He would have heard. Would have come down. The laugh came again, followed by a deeper sound. A male voice, low and intimate in a way that made her stomach turn to ice. Elena's feet moved before her mind could catch up. One step, another. The stairs creaked under her weight. The same creaks they'd always made. 3rd step, 7th step, the 11th one near the top. She'd counted them 1,000 times. Late nights coming home from the office. Early mornings sneaking down to make coffee without waking Greg. Now each creak sounded like a warning. Like the house itself was trying to tell her to turn around. To leave. To not see what she was about to see. The bedroom door was half open. Not closed. Not all the way open. Just enough. She could see the edge of the bed. The cream-colored duvet they'd bought on sale at Target. The one she'd washed every Sunday without fail. The afternoon light spilled through the window. Golden and warm. Illuminating dust particles floating lazy in the air. Everything looked so normal. So impossibly, devastatingly normal. She pushed the door open with her fingertips. It swung slowly, hinges making the smallest sound. A whisper of metal on metal. And there they were. Greg, her husband of 5 years, the man she'd promised forever to in front of everyone they knew, was in their bed with someone else. Not a stranger. That might have been easier somehow. Might have made less sense, but hurt in a simpler way. It was Melissa. Melissa Crane. Her best friend since sophomore year of college. The woman who'd been her maid of honor. Who'd helped her pick out this house. Who'd sat at this very kitchen table a week ago drinking wine and complaining about her dating life, saying she'd never find anyone worth keeping. They hadn't heard the door, or maybe they had and didn't care. Melissa's red hair, that distinctive copper shade she'd always been vain about, spilled across Elena's pillow. Greg's hand was tangled in it. The sheet had fallen to their waists. They were kissing like people in movies kissed, desperate and consuming, like nothing else in the world existed. Elena made no sound. She couldn't. Her throat had closed completely. Her lungs had forgotten how to work. She was a statue, a ghost, a witness to the ending of everything she'd believed about her life. On the wall behind them, her wedding dress still hung in its preservation bag, the one she'd never gotten around to storing in the attic. The white fabric glowed faintly in the afternoon sun. On the dresser, framed photos smiled obliviously. Elena and Greg cutting their wedding cake. Elena and Melissa at graduation, arms around each other, young and bright with futures that seemed limitless. All of it. Lies. All of it. Meaningless. Melissa saw her first. Her eyes opened mid-kiss, unfocused, then sharpened with sudden recognition. She gasped, pulled away, grabbed for the sheet. Greg turned, and for one infinite second, they made eye contact. His face went through a rapid progression of emotions. Surprise, confusion, then guilt, raw and undeniable. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Elena," he said, her name strange in his mouth like he'd forgotten how to say it. "I can explain." The laugh that came out of her didn't sound human. It was harsh, broken, a sound from somewhere deep and animal. "Explain," she repeated. Not a question. Not really anything. Just a word that suddenly meant nothing. Melissa was crying now, mascara running in black streams down her cheeks, clutching the sheet to her chest like modesty mattered anymore. "Oh God, Elena, I'm so sorry. We didn't mean. It just happened. We tried to stop." "How long?" Elena heard herself ask. Her voice was eerily calm, detached, like she was asking about the weather or what time a store closed. Greg was getting out of bed now, grabbing his boxers from the floor, trying to put them on while maintaining some impossible dignity. "It doesn't matter. It's not. This isn't what you think." "How?" "Long." Each word a stone. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the floor, at the wall, at anything but her face. 3 months, he finally whispered. 3 months. 90 days. All those nights he'd come home late. All those showers the moment he walked in. All those times he'd turned away from her in bed, claiming exhaustion, claiming stress. The birthday dinner last month where Melissa had joined them, sitting across the table, smiling, laughing at his jokes, her foot probably touching his under the table while Elena talked about work, about her hopes for the promotion, about the future she thought they were building together. The room tilted. Elena grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then expanded again. She could see everything with terrible clarity. Greg's watch on the nightstand, the one she'd given him for their anniversary, Melissa's purse on the floor, the designer one Elena had helped her pick out last Christmas, the half-empty water glass on Elena's side of the bed. They'd been here before, multiple times, in her home, in her bed, drinking her water. "Get out," she said. "Elena, please. Let's talk about this. We can work through—" Greg was walking toward her, hands out like he was approaching a wild animal. "Get out." Louder now, stronger. Something crystallizing in her chest, sharp and cold and unbreakable. She turned before he could respond, before Melissa could say whatever worthless thing she was about to say. She walked down the stairs on numb legs, through the living room they'd furnished together, past the kitchen where they'd made breakfast together just this morning, a lifetime ago. She grabbed her purse from where she'd dropped it by the door, her keys, her phone. Behind her, she heard scrambling, hushed voices, the sound of people trying to dress quickly, trying to figure out what to do. She didn't care, didn't turn around. She opened the door, walked out into the too bright October afternoon, got in her car, and drove. She didn't know where she was going, just away, away from that house, that bed, those people who'd carved out her heart, and left her standing there watching them do it. The streets blurred past. She drove until she hit the highway, then kept driving until she saw the faded sign for the Riverside Motel, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour or the week, that didn't ask questions, that existed in the margins where people went when they had nowhere else to be. The woman at the desk had gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. She didn't comment on the fact that Elena had no luggage, that her hands were shaking as she filled out the registration card, that tears were falling silently onto the countertop, making the ink run. "Room 12, the woman said gently, sliding a key across the desk. "End of the hallway. Quiet." Elena took the key. It was attached to a plastic tag shaped like a keyhole, the number 12 printed in fading black marker. She walked down the exterior corridor, past rooms with drawn curtains and humming air conditioners, past a vending machine with a flickering light. She unlocked the door to room 12 and stepped inside. The room was exactly what she expected. Beige walls, industrial carpet worn thin in paths between the door and the bed and the bathroom. A television bolted to the dresser, the smell of old cigarettes and cleaning products. She set her purse on the bed, which sagged slightly in the middle. Then she sat down beside it and stared at the wall. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky. Cars passed on the highway. Life went on. Somewhere, Greg and Melissa were probably getting dressed, probably talking in hushed tones about what to do, how to fix this, whether Elena would come back. Somewhere, her former coworkers were finishing their workday, logging off computers, making plans for dinner. And here, in room 12 of the Riverside Motel, Elena Hartfield sat perfectly still and felt the entire architecture of her life collapse into dust. The first night in room 12, Elena didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed with her shoes still on, purse in her lap, staring at the digital clock on the nightstand as the red numbers changed with excruciating slowness. 7:03 became 7:04 became 7:05, each minute a small eternity. The motel hummed with the sounds of other people's lives bleeding through thin walls, a television playing a game show, a couple arguing in Spanish, a door slamming, a car engine starting, the highway traffic a constant white noise that never quite faded into background. Her phone buzzed intermittently on the polyester bedspread. Greg's name lighting up the screen over and over. 17 missed calls by midnight, then text messages, each one a small knife. "Please come home. We need to talk. I'm sorry. Where are you? Elena, answer me. I'm worried." Then Melissa's name appearing too, another betrayal even in digital form. "I know you hate me, but please talk to Greg. This is all my fault. I never meant to hurt you." The words meant nothing. They were sounds without substance, apologies without weight. She turned the phone face down and watched the ceiling instead. Water-stained tiles, the kind that suggested leaks from the room above, patterns that looked almost intentional, almost artistic in their decay. A crack running from the corner toward the center, branching like veins or rivers, or the lines that appeared on her palms when she made a fist. She made a fist, opened it, made it again. Her wedding ring caught the light from the lamp, gold band with 3 small diamonds she'd once thought were beautiful. Now it felt like a shackle, a lie wrapped around her finger. She twisted it but didn't take it off. Not yet. Taking it off would make it real. The second day, she left the room only once, to use the vending machine. She bought a bottle of water and a package of cheese crackers that tasted like cardboard and salt. The woman at the front desk, the same gray-haired woman from before, watched her through the office window, but didn't wave. Elena was grateful for that. She wasn't ready for kindness. Kindness would break her, and she needed to stay intact, needed to hold herself together with whatever remained of her will. Back in the room, she lay on the bed fully clothed and stared at the television without turning it on. Her reflection stared back from the black screen, distorted and ghostly. She looked like a stranger. Hair tangled, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, the navy blazer wrinkled and creased from sleeping in it. She'd worn this blazer yesterday morning thinking it was the beginning of something. Now it felt like a costume from a play that had closed without warning. The memories came in waves. Not chronological, not organized. Just fragments, sharp and random. Greg's face when he'd said 3 months, like he was confessing to a minor inconvenience. Melissa's red hair spread across the pillow Elena had slept on just the night before. The wedding dress hanging on the wall, pristine and mocking. Her boss's careful voice saying, "Let you go," as if she were a balloon floating away instead of a person being discarded. The taste of morning coffee in her kitchen, the last morning before everything changed. Greg's lips on the top of her head, absent and automatic. Had he been thinking about Melissa even then? Had he kissed her goodbye while planning to spend the afternoon with someone else? She pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw colors. Red, purple, gold. Shapes that meant nothing. Her chest felt hollow, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything essential, leaving only the mechanics. Heart still beating, lungs still breathing, but nothing else. No purpose, no future. Just the endless present tense of existing without living. By the third day, her phone had stopped buzzing. The silence was worse than the noise. It meant they'd given up. Or maybe it meant they were relieved. Maybe Greg and Melissa were together right now. In her house. In her bed. Glad that Elena had removed herself from the equation so cleanly. Maybe they were laughing about it. Maybe they were planning their future. The one that had been stolen from her and handed to them like a gift. She should have been angry. She knew that. Anger would have been appropriate. Would have been healthy. Would have given her something to do with the feeling that sat in her chest like a stone. But she couldn't find it. She felt only emptiness, and a strange, detached curiosity about how much pain a person could hold before they simply stopped being a person at all. The motel woman knocked on the door on the afternoon of the fourth day. Elena had lost track of time. The knock was soft, apologetic. "Just checking if you need anything, honey," came the voice through the door. "Fresh towels, some soap." Elena's voice came out rough from disuse. "I'm fine. Okay then. I'm Rose, by the way. Rose Chen. If you need anything at all, you just come find me." Footsteps retreating. Kindness offered without expectation. Elena's eyes burned, but no tears came. She'd cried herself empty on day 2. Great heaving sobs that had left her throat raw and her head pounding. Now there was nothing left. Just the hollow in the ceiling and the clock counting minutes that added up to nothing. She thought about calling her mother, about calling her sister, about calling anyone who might care that her life had imploded in the span of 6 hours. But what would she say? How do you explain that you lost everything before lunch? That your husband and your best friend had been betraying you while you worked late, while you planned anniversaries, while you believed in futures that never existed? The shame of it was almost worse than the pain. The humiliation of being so completely fooled. On the 5th day, she took a shower. The water was lukewarm, and the pressure weak. But it felt like absolution anyway. She stood under the spray until it ran cold, until her skin was pink and wrinkled, until she felt something close to clean. She looked at herself in the foggy mirror afterward, naked and dripping, and saw someone she didn't recognize, thinner already, hollowed out, haunted. She wrapped herself in the scratchy motel towel and sat on the bed and stared at her phone. The battery was at 12%. She should charge it. Should check her bank account, should figure out what came next. But what came next felt impossible. A country she'd never learned the language for. A map without roads. Somewhere deep inside, buried beneath the numbness and the shock and the overwhelming weight of loss, a small voice spoke. It was barely a whisper, easily ignored, fragile as spider silk. But it was there, and it said one word, quiet and insistent and utterly terrifying in its simplicity. Survive. The money ran out on the 8th day. Elena had been rationing what little cash she'd had in her wallet, buying nothing but water and crackers from the vending machine. But even that meager existence had limits. Rose Chen found her sitting in the parking lot on a concrete parking barrier, staring at her empty wallet like it might magically produce bills if she looked at it long enough. The October sun was weak and pale, the kind of light that gave no warmth, only illumination. Rose sat down beside her without asking permission, her joints creaking audibly in the quiet. She smelled like jasmine and laundry detergent. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rose said, "You can't stay here without paying. I got bills too, but I know someone who could use some help." Elena turned to look at her. Rose's face was deeply lined, eyes dark and knowing, the face of someone who'd seen plenty of people hit bottom and understood that judgment helped no one. "I don't have any skills," Elena heard herself say. "I was an accountant. I'm not anymore." "You got hands? Can you carry things? Arrange flowers?" "Flowers? My friend Dorothy runs a shop. Petala and Poeira, Portuguese, means petal and dust. She's getting on in years. Needs someone to help with the physical stuff. It don't pay much, but it's something. She's good people. Doesn't ask questions she doesn't need answers to." Elena looked down at her hands. The hands that had typed thousands of spreadsheets, that had worn a wedding ring for 5 years, that had packed a cardboard box with the remnants of a career that had ended before it began. They looked ordinary, capable, like they belonged to someone who could do things, be things, survive things. "Okay," she whispered. Rose pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket and a pencil from behind her ear. She wrote an address in careful block letters. "Tell her Rose sent you. She'll understand what that means." Petala and Poera occupied a narrow storefront on Briarwood Street, wedged between a thrift store and a place that sold used books. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters slightly crooked, charming in their imperfection. Through the window, Elena could see explosions of color, flowers in buckets and vases, hanging plants creating a canopy of green. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, working up the courage to go inside. This wasn't her world. She dealt with numbers, with logic, with things that made sense. Flowers were chaos, beauty without purpose, alive. The bell above the door chimed when she pushed it open. The smell hit her immediately, overwhelming and complex. Earth and pollen and something sweet she couldn't name. The shop was small and crowded, every surface covered with blooms in various states of life, some fresh and vibrant, others beginning to wilt, petals browning at the edges. A radio played classical music somewhere in the back, barely audible beneath the hum of a cooler. "Be right with you," called a voice from behind a wall of sunflowers. Elena waited, hands clasped in front of her, suddenly aware of how she must look. She'd showered that morning, but her clothes were wrinkled from days of wear, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, no makeup, nothing to hide the exhaustion etched into her face. The woman who emerged from behind the sunflowers was probably in her 70s, maybe older, with white hair pulled into a bun and hands covered in soil. She wore a canvas apron over a floral dress, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. Her eyes were sharp and blue and missed nothing. "You must be the one Rose called about," she said, not making it a question. "I'm Elena Hartfield. Rose said you might need help." Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron and studied Elena with the same intensity she might apply to inspecting a rose for aphids. "You know anything about flowers?" "No." "You know anything about hard work?" "Yes." Dorothy nodded slowly. "What happened to you?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Elena felt her carefully constructed walls crack just slightly. "I lost my job and my husband on the same day." "He cheat?" "Yes." "With someone you knew?" "My best friend." Dorothy made a sound that was half sympathy, half disgust. "Men are mostly idiots and women can be worse. You looking for pity or you looking for purpose?" Elena blinked. No one had asked her that. Everyone she'd imagined telling this story to would have offered comfort, condolences, careful words about healing and time. Dorothy was offering something different, something harder and somehow more honest. "Purpose," Elena said, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. "Good. I don't got time for pity parties. I open at 7, close at 6. Lunch is 30 minutes. You'll arrange flowers, sweep floors, haul buckets, deal with customers. Some of them are lovely, some are nightmares. You treat them all the same. I pay $8.50 an hour under the table because I can't afford proper payroll. You need more than that, this ain't the place. You steal from me, I'll know, and you'll regret it. You show up drunk or high, you're gone. You show up on time and work hard, we'll get along fine. Questions?" Elena's head spun trying to keep up. $8.50 an hour wouldn't cover much. Wouldn't cover rent anywhere decent. Wouldn't cover car insurance or food, or the mountain of problems she'd been avoiding thinking about. But it was something. It was movement. It was the opposite of lying in a motel room waiting to disappear. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow. 7 sharp. Wear clothes you don't mind ruining." "Flowers are beautiful, but they're also messy as hell." Dorothy extended a hand. Elena shook it. The older woman's grip was strong, her palm calloused and warm. "You're gonna be okay, girl," Dorothy said. And there was no pity in it, just statement of fact. "You don't know it yet, but you are. You got the look of someone who's been knocked down. That's fine. Everybody gets knocked down. What matters is whether you get back up. You're here. That's getting up." Elena left the shop with nothing resolved, nothing fixed, no clarity about what came next beyond showing up tomorrow at 7. But as she walked back to her car, the autumn sun breaking through clouds for the first time in days, she felt something she hadn't felt since walking out of her house 8 days ago. She felt like maybe, Possibly, against all logic and reason, she might survive this after all. Elena's first week at Pedala and Poera passed in a blur of repetitive motion and aching muscles. She learned that roses had thorns that could pierce through gloves if you weren't careful, that lilies dropped pollen that stained everything it touched, that carnations lasted longer than almost any other flower if you cut the stems at an angle and changed the water daily. Dorothy taught her in short, clipped sentences, demonstrating once and expecting Elena to remember. There was no patience for mistakes, but there was also no cruelty, just the simple expectation that Elena would learn or leave. By the second week, Elena's hands were covered in small cuts, and her back protested every morning when she climbed out of the narrow bed in the efficiency apartment she'd managed to rent above a Korean grocery store. The apartment smelled like kimchi, and had a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was hers, paid for with money she'd earned, and that mattered in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She fell asleep each night too exhausted to think about Greg or Melissa, or the life that had been taken from her. It wasn't healing exactly. It was survival through distraction, but it was something. The man started coming in on Fridays during her third week. Elena noticed him immediately, because he was the only customer who never seemed in a hurry. Most people rushed in during their lunch breaks or after work, grabbing pre-made arrangements, asking for recommendations, checking their watches. This man walked slowly, methodically examining each bucket of flowers like he was searching for something specific that he'd know when he found it. He wore dark jeans and a gray Henley, work boots that had seen actual work, and carried himself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. He was probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of face that looked like it didn't smile often but might be striking when it did. Not handsome in the conventional way. Handsome in the way of old buildings or worn leather. Something about the lines and angles that suggested stories. The first Friday, he bought white carnations. A dozen of them. Dorothy handled the transaction while Elena swept the floor nearby, close enough to hear their brief exchange. "Beautiful day," Dorothy had said, making conversation the way she did with regulars. "Yes, ma'am," he'd replied, voice low and slightly rough, like he didn't use it much. "Special occasion?" A pause. "Something like that." He'd paid in cash, left a $5 tip in the jar by the register, and walked out carrying the flowers wrapped in brown paper, like they were something precious. The second Friday, Elena was at the register when he came in. Up close, she could see his eyes were dark brown, almost black, with shadows underneath that suggested he didn't sleep well. He gave her a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement strangers give each other in small spaces, and went straight to the carnations. White ones again. Same quantity. When he brought them to the counter, Elena's hands moved through the familiar motions, trimming the stems, wrapping them in paper, tying the string. She'd gotten good at it, the muscle memory developing faster than she'd expected. Her fingers no longer fumbled with the knots. $12.50, she said, and her voice came out steadier than it had in weeks. He handed her a 20. While she made change, he stood perfectly still, patient in a way that felt uncommon. Most people filled silence with small talk or phone scrolling. He just waited, present and quiet. These for someone special? Elena found herself asking, immediately regretting it. It wasn't her business. She was here to sell flowers, not interrogate customers about their lives. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. "My mother," he said finally. "She passed away 3 years ago. I bring these to her grave every Friday." White carnations were her favorite. The air between them shifted, became heavier somehow. Elena felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." He took his change, dropped the bills in the tip jar, picked up his flowers. At the door, he paused and turned back. "I'm Aaron, by the way. Aaron Dalton." "Elena Hartfield." "Nice to meet you, Elena Hartfield." And then he was gone, the bell chiming his exit. Dorothy appeared from the back room where she'd been repotting orchids. "That one's been coming here for 2 years now. Never misses a Friday. Rain, snow, doesn't matter. Most devoted son I ever seen." Elena found herself thinking about Aaron Dalton throughout the following week. Not in a romantic way, nothing like that. She wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that again. But there was something about his quiet grief, his weekly ritual of love and remembrance, that stuck with her. 3 years, and he still brought flowers. 3 years, and he still showed up. It suggested a capacity for loyalty, for devotion, for seeing something through that she'd thought no longer existed in people. The next Friday, he came in earlier than usual, around 10 in the morning. Elena was arranging a funeral spray, white roses and baby's breath, her hands moving with increasing confidence. She looked up when the bell chimed and felt something strange flutter in her chest. Not attraction, exactly. More like recognition, like seeing someone who understood something fundamental about loss without needing to explain it. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He walked to the carnations, but this time he hesitated. "Do you have any recommendations for someone who's been buying the same flowers for 3 years? Elena set down the roses and came around the counter. She led him to a bucket she'd filled that morning with stock flowers, their spicy, sweet scent filling the immediate area. "These last a long time. They're sturdy, and they come in white." Aaron bent to smell them, and something in his shoulders relaxed slightly. "These are nice. She would have liked these." "Your mother?" "Yeah." She was practical, like things that lasted. Hated waste. He selected stems carefully, taking his time. She used to say that carnations were honest flowers. No pretense. Just straightforward beauty. Elena felt her eyes sting and blinked rapidly. She didn't know why this stranger's grief was affecting her so deeply, why his words about his mother were landing in her chest like stones. Maybe because he was proof that love didn't always end in betrayal, that some people stayed devoted even after death, that faithfulness was real, even if she'd never experienced it. She helped him select a dozen stock flowers mixed with white carnations, wrapped them more carefully than she'd wrapped anything before. When she handed them over, their fingers touched briefly. His hands were calloused, warm, real. "Thank you," he said, "for the recommendation, and for—" He trailed off, searching for words. "For being kind." "Of course." He left the usual tip, maybe a little more, and headed toward the door. But this time he stopped without being asked and turned back. "Do you work here every Friday?" "Every day except Sundays. Dorothy closes Sundays." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you next week, Elena Hartfield." After he left, Dorothy came out from the back wearing a knowing smile that Elena pretended not to see. She went back to the funeral arrangement, but her hands felt different now, steadier, like maybe they were remembering how to create something beautiful instead of just going through motions. And in her chest, where everything had been hollow and dark, there was the smallest spark of something she was afraid to name. Not hope exactly, but maybe the memory of what hope had felt like. Aaron Dalton started coming to the shop on days that weren't Friday, Tuesday mornings before the lunch rush, Thursday afternoons when the light slanted golden through the windows. He always bought something small, a single stem, a potted succulent. Once, inexplicably, a bag of fertilizer that Dorothy had been trying to sell for months. He never stayed long, never imposed, but his presence began to mark Elena's weeks in a way she couldn't quite explain and wasn't ready to examine. It started with coffee. The third Tuesday he came in, he arrived carrying 2 cups from the diner down the street, steam curling from the lids. He set one on the counter near Elena without ceremony, without expectation. "Black with 1 sugar," he said. "But if you don't drink coffee or I got it wrong, no offense taken." Elena stared at the cup like it might be a hallucination. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess. You seem like a 1 sugar person." She wasn't sure what that meant, but she took the coffee anyway. And it was perfect, exactly the way she took it. Warm and slightly bitter, and grounding in the way only coffee could be. "Thank you." He nodded and bought a small pot of lavender, and left. The whole interaction had taken maybe 3 minutes, but Elena thought about it for the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone, trying to find the angle, the hidden motivation, the catch. Men didn't do nice things without wanting something back. That's what she'd learned. That's what Greg had taught her. But Aaron kept showing up, kept doing small things, and never asked for anything in return. He helped her carry heavy buckets of water from the back room when he arrived, and Dorothy was with another customer. He held the door open for elderly patrons struggling with walkers. Once, when a delivery truck blocked the loading zone and the driver refused to move, Aaron had a quiet word with him that Elena couldn't hear, and suddenly the truck was moving. Problem solved. No drama. "That one's a keeper," Dorothy said one afternoon after Aaron had left. shaking her head with approval. Doesn't see you as a project or a conquest. Sees you as a person. Rare quality. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her walls, wanted to insist she wasn't interested and he wasn't special, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. She looked forward to his visits, found herself checking the clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, felt disappointed when he didn't show, relieved when he did. They started talking. Real talking. Not just transactional exchanges about flowers and payment. He told her about his job as a carpenter, restoring old houses, bringing back details that modern construction had forgotten. Crown molding, original hardwood, the kind of work that required patience and precision and respect for what came before. He told her about his mother, how she'd raised him alone after his father left when Aaron was 6, how she'd worked 2 jobs to keep him fed and clothed and in school, how she'd died suddenly of an aneurysm while making breakfast one ordinary Tuesday morning. I was at work, he said, staring at a bucket of daisies without really seeing them. Got the call from her neighbor. By the time I got to the hospital, she was already gone. Never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell her that everything I am is because of her. Elena felt tears on her cheeks before she realized she was crying. Not just for him, but for herself. For everyone who'd lost something they couldn't get back. Who lived with the weight of words unsaid and moments unrepeatable. I'm sorry, she whispered. That's not fair. No, he agreed. It's not. But life rarely is. She told him about Greg eventually. Not all of it. Not the worst parts. But enough. How she'd lost her job and her marriage within hours. How she'd found them together in her bed. How she'd driven until she couldn't drive anymore and ended up here, in this flower shop, trying to remember how to be human. Aaron listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes or trying to fix anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My ex-wife cheated too, 5 years ago. Found out when I came home early from a job and caught her with my business partner. Lost my marriage and my company in the same week. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw her own pain reflected back. Not identical. Everyone's breaking was unique, but the same fundamental understanding that the people you trusted most were capable of destroying you completely. How did you survive it? She asked. Honestly, I'm not sure I did. Not all the way, but I got up every day, went to work, built things with my hands, eventually started my own company again, smaller, but mine, visited my mom's grave every Friday, found ways to keep moving even when I didn't want to. He met her eyes, kind of like what you're doing now. Something shifted between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both wounded, both rebuilding, both terrified of trusting again, but exhausted from being alone. The weeks folded into each other. October became November. The flowers in the shop changed with the season. Chrysanthemums replaced summer blooms. The air got colder. Elena bought a real winter coat instead of just layering the blazer she'd worn from her old life. She got her first paycheck and cried in her apartment because it was hers, earned through her own labor, not dependent on anyone else. And Aaron kept coming, kept bringing coffee, kept having quiet conversations between customers, kept existing in her space with a gentleness she'd forgotten was possible. One Thursday in late November, he arrived carrying not coffee but lunch. 2 sandwiches from the Italian place 3 blocks over. You've been looking thin, he said, not unkindly. Dorothy said you forget to eat. They sat in the back room on upturned buckets, surrounded by spare vases and pruning shears, eating sandwiches and not talking about anything important. The weather. A house he was working on. A difficult customer who'd demanded Elena remake an arrangement 3 times. Normal things. Human things. Halfway through her sandwich, Elena realized she was smiling. Actually smiling. Not the customer service smile she'd perfected, but a real one. Genuine and unguarded. And Aaron was smiling back. Small and quiet, but present. I like this, she said, without thinking. Just sitting here. With you. He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. I like it too. Neither of them said the things that were obvious, that this was becoming something, that the space between them was charged with possibility, that they were both terrified, that they were both ready and not ready in equal measure. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, interrupting with perfect timing like she always did, Break's over, lovebirds. Got a wedding order that needs finishing. Elena felt her face heat, but Aaron just laughed, a sound she'd never heard from him before, low and genuine and transforming. He stood, gathered the sandwich wrappers, squeezed Elena's shoulder briefly as he passed. That small touch sent electricity through her entire body. Same time next week? He asked from the doorway. Same time, she confirmed. After he left, Dorothy gave her a look that said everything and nothing. Elena went back to the wedding flowers, white roses and eucalyptus, and for the first time in 2 months, she allowed herself to think about the future not as a threat, but as a possibility. Scary and uncertain, yes, but maybe, possibly containing something worth the risk. December arrived with unexpected snow, the kind that transformed the city overnight into something clean and unfamiliar. Elena stood at the shop window on a Tuesday morning, watching fat flakes drift past the glass, when the bell chimed behind her. She turned expecting Aaron. It was his usual time, but instead found herself face to face with a ghost. Greg stood in the doorway, shaking snow from his hair, holding a bouquet of red roses that looked expensive and out of place in the modest shop. He wore the camel-colored coat she'd bought him 2 Christmases ago, the one he'd complained was too fancy for everyday wear, but had worn anyway because she'd asked him to. His face looked thinner than she remembered. Older somehow, with new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 months ago. Elena's first instinct was to run. Her second was to scream. Her third was to laugh at the absurdity of him standing there with roses like he was some romantic hero, instead of the man who destroyed everything she'd believed about love and loyalty and forever. She did none of these things. She just stood there, flower shears still in her hand, staring at him like he was something that had crawled out of her nightmares into the waking world. "Elena," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "I've been looking for you everywhere. You found me." Her voice came out flat, emotionless, the tone she'd perfected for difficult customers who demanded impossibilities. "Congratulations." He took a step closer, and she took a step back, an involuntary movement that made him stop, hands raised in surrender. "I just want to talk. Please. 5 minutes." "No. Elena, please. I made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake of my life. I've been trying to reach you for months. Your phone's disconnected. You're not at the apartment. I didn't know where else to look, and then someone mentioned seeing you here, and I—" "Stop." The word came out harder than she intended, sharp enough to cut. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up with flowers and apologies and expect me to listen." Dorothy emerged from the back room, her presence immediately changing the energy. She sized up Greg in approximately 2 seconds, and her expression turned glacial. "We got a problem here?" "No problem," Elena said quickly. "This is my ex-husband. He was just leaving." Greg's eyes widened. "Ex?" "Elena, we're not divorced. We're still married. We can work this out. I know I hurt you, but I love you. I never stopped loving you. Melissa meant nothing. It was a mistake, a stupid, selfish mistake. But it's over. She's gone. I ended it. I want you back. I want us back." The words that might have shattered her 3 months ago now landed like pebbles on armor. Elena set down the shears carefully, deliberately, using the movement to center herself. When she spoke, her voice was steady, each word chosen with precision. "You want to know something, Greg? I spent weeks after I left thinking about what I'd say if I ever saw you again. I had speeches prepared, angry ones, sad ones, ones where I begged you to explain why I wasn't enough. But standing here now, looking at you, I realize I don't need any of those speeches. Because you didn't just cheat on me with Melissa. You cheated me out of years of my life. You let me believe we had something real while you were somewhere else entirely. You made me feel crazy for noticing you were distant. You gaslit me every time I asked if something was wrong. And the worst part? You're not even sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught." Greg's face went through several expressions. Shock. Denial. Then something uglier. Anger. "That's not fair. You were never home. Always working late. Always putting that job first. What was I supposed to do? I was lonely. I needed someone who actually saw me." The laugh that escaped Elena was bitter and genuine. "So it's my fault? I worked late because we needed the money. Because you kept talking about wanting to buy a house, start a family, build a future. I was building that future for us, and you were in our bed with my best friend. Don't you dare try to make this about me not being enough." Dorothy moved closer to Elena, a subtle show of solidarity. Greg noticed, and his expression hardened. "Who's this? Your new boss? Or is there something else going on here? That would be rich. You judging me while you— Get out." Elena's voice dropped to something cold and final. "Get out of this shop. Get out of my life. Whatever we had is dead. I don't want your apologies or your flowers or your revisionist history. I want you gone." "You're making a mistake," Greg said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You'll regret this. You'll realize what you threw away, and by then it'll be too late. The only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were sooner." Elena walked to the door and opened it, letting in a blast of cold air and swirling snow. "Goodbye, Greg." He stood there for a long moment, the roses wilting slightly in his grip, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Then he threw the roses on the floor, petals scattering like drops of blood on the worn wood, and stormed out. The bell chimed his exit, cheerful and oblivious. Elena closed the door, locked it, and turned the sign to closed, even though it was barely 11. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, her breath coming in short gasps. Dorothy guided her to the back room, sat her down on one of the buckets, pressed a glass of water into her hands. "You did good," Dorothy said firmly. "Real good. That took strength." "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm going to throw up." "That's normal. First time facing your demon always is." Dorothy patted her shoulder awkwardly. "But you stood your ground. Didn't let him twist things. Didn't fall for his games. That's everything." Elena sipped the water, trying to calm her racing heart. The door chimed again, and she tensed, afraid Greg had come back. But it was Aaron, snow dusting his shoulders, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a bag that smelled like cinnamon rolls. He took one look at Elena's face and set everything down. "What happened?" Dorothy answered because Elena couldn't find words. "Ex-husband showed up. She handled it like a warrior, but she could probably use a friend right now." Aaron's jaw tightened, but he said nothing about Greg. He just pulled up another bucket and sat across from Elena, close but not crowding, present but not demanding. "Want to talk about it or want to pretend it didn't happen for a while?" "Pretend," Elena whispered. "Please." So they sat in the back room surrounded by flowers and pruning shears and the detritus of daily work, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, eating cinnamon rolls that Aaron had brought without knowing they'd be needed. Dorothy bustled around, giving them space while maintaining protective proximity, and slowly, minute by minute, Elena felt her heartbeat return to normal, felt the panic recede, felt something settle in her chest. She'd faced Greg, had said the things she needed to say, had stood her ground and sent him away, and she'd survived it, more than survived. She'd won. "Thank you," she said to Aaron. "For being here, always," he replied simply, and the word hung between them, weighted with promise and possibility, and the understanding that some things were worth showing up for, again and again, without being asked. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in white, erasing footprints, making everything new. Christmas came and went quietly. Elena worked through the holiday rush at the shop, making arrangements for parties she wasn't invited to, creating centerpieces for tables she'd never sit at. She spent Christmas Eve alone in her apartment eating Chinese takeout and watching old movies, and found that the solitude didn't hurt the way she'd expected. It was peaceful in its own way. Uncomplicated. Hers. Aaron had invited her to dinner with some friends, but she'd declined, not ready for the questions and curiosity that would inevitably come. He'd understood without her having to explain, had simply left a small wrapped box on the shop counter before closing time on Christmas Eve. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple and delicate, with a single charm in the shape of a flower. The note tucked inside said only, "For new beginnings, Aaron." Elena wore it every day after that, the cool metal against her wrist a constant reminder that kindness existed, that not everyone wanted to hurt her, that maybe trust wasn't completely dead, just cautiously sleeping. January arrived cold and clear, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharp and possible. Aaron had been coming to the shop less frequently, and Elena told herself it was because he was busy with work, that winter was a slow time for restoration projects, that it didn't mean anything. But she missed him in a way that scared her, missed their conversations, and his quiet presence, and the way he looked at her like she was someone worth knowing. On a Friday night, the first Friday in February, he appeared at closing time. Elena was sweeping the floor. Dorothy had already left, the shop dim except for the security lights. She looked up at the knock and found Aaron standing outside, breath fogging the glass, wearing a dark coat and an expression she couldn't quite read. She unlocked the door. "We're closed." "I know. I was hoping you might make an exception." He stepped inside, bringing cold air and the scent of winter. "I wanted to ask you something, and I didn't want to do it with an audience." Elena's heart began to pound. She set the broom aside, suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The silence of the empty shop, the way the streetlight outside cast shadows through the window, the nervous energy radiating from Aaron despite his careful composure. "What is it?" He took a breath, seeming to gather courage. "Would you have dinner with me? Not coffee between customers or lunch in the back room. An actual dinner. Somewhere nice. Tomorrow night." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities and the weight of everything they'd been dancing around for months. Elena felt panic and hope war in her chest. She wanted to say yes, wanted it so badly it terrified her. But wanting something and being ready for it were different things. "Aaron, I don't know if I'm ready for this. For dating. For anything that looks like a relationship." "I'm not asking for a relationship," he said gently. "I'm asking for dinner. One meal. No expectations. No pressure. Just two people who enjoy each other's company sharing food and conversation. If it feels wrong, we go back to being friends. If it feels right, maybe we have dinner again sometime. But Elena, I need you to know something." He took a step closer and she didn't step back. "Progress. I wasn't looking for this," he continued. "Wasn't looking for you. After my divorce, I decided I was better off alone. Safer that way. Can't get hurt if you don't let anyone in. I visited my mom's grave every Friday and worked on houses and convinced myself that was enough. And then I walked into this shop, and there you were, broken and brave and trying so hard to survive. And I recognized you because I was the same, am the same. And over these months, watching you rebuild yourself, watching you laugh again, watching you stand up to your ex-husband and send him away, I realized something." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I realized that being alone isn't the same as being safe. It's just being alone. And I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of visiting graves and restoring other people's homes while my own life stays empty. I'm tired of being scared. And I think maybe you're tired too." Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I am tired," she whispered. "But Aaron, I'm so scared. Greg destroyed me. What he did, how he lied, how little I mattered to him in the end. I don't know if I can survive that again. I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are strong enough," he said with absolute certainty. "You're the strongest person I know. But I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm just asking you to try. With me. Because I'm scared too. Terrified, actually. My ex took my trust and shredded it, left me unable to believe in anything good. But then you happened, and I want to try. Not because I'm not scared, but because I think what we could have together might be worth the fear." The shop was so quiet Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the radiator clicking in the corner, could hear the distant sound of traffic outside. Everything narrowed to this moment, this choice, this man standing in front of her offering something she'd thought was impossible. "One dinner," she said finally, voice shaking. "Somewhere nice." The smile that spread across Aaron's face was like watching sunrise, slow and transformative, and impossibly beautiful. "One dinner," he agreed. "I'll pick you up at 7. Wear something that makes you feel like yourself." After he left, Elena locked up the shop and walked to her car in the frozen parking lot. The night was clear and cold, stars visible for once through the city light pollution. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, the bracelet cool against her wrist, her heart hammering with equal parts terror and hope. Tomorrow night she would have dinner with Aaron Dalton. Tomorrow night she would take a step toward something new and uncertain, and possibly wonderful. Tomorrow night she would choose to be brave, even though being brave meant risking everything all over again. She drove home through empty streets, and for the first time since October, When she thought about the future, she didn't see only darkness and loss. She saw possibility. Fragile and frightening, yes, but there. Undeniably there. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. The dinner had been perfect in the way real moments are perfect. Not orchestrated or dramatic, but genuine and warm and achingly human. Aaron had taken her to a small Italian restaurant tucked into a neighborhood she'd never explored. The kind of place where the owner knew regulars by name, and the menu was handwritten on a chalkboard that changed daily. They'd talked for 3 hours, about everything and nothing, about childhoods and disappointments and the strange ways life redirected you when you least expected it. He'd reached across the table halfway through the meal and taken her hand, and she'd let him, and it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months that had passed in a blur of ordinary moments that somehow added up to extraordinary. Coffee on Tuesday mornings, dinners on weekend evenings, long walks through the city when the weather turned warm again, conversations that lasted until 2 a.m, sitting on the steps of her apartment building watching occasional cars pass. Aaron never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He just showed up, consistently, reliably, becoming part of the architecture of her days until she couldn't imagine them without him. Dorothy had retired in April, her arthritis finally forcing her to admit she couldn't manage the physical demands of the shop anymore. She'd offered to sell it to Elena for a price so reasonable it was essentially a gift, payments spread over years at almost no interest. Elena had said yes before fully thinking it through, terror and excitement warring in her chest. She was a business owner now. It was her name on the paperwork, her decisions that mattered, her future she was building with her own hands. Aaron had helped her paint the shop that spring, the two of them working late into evenings after closing, covering the old cream walls with a soft sage green that made the flowers pop against it. They'd painted in comfortable silence mostly, occasionally breaking into conversation about nothing important. Once, she'd turned to find him watching her instead of working, paint flecked in his hair, something soft and wondering in his eyes. "What?" she'd asked, self-conscious. "Nothing. Just thinking about how different you look from when I first met you." "Different how?" "Alive," he'd said simply. "You look alive now." She'd kissed him then, paint-covered hands and all, pressed up against the wall they'd just finished, tasting turpentine and coffee and promise. It wasn't their first kiss, but it felt significant somehow, a claiming of space and future, and the possibility that broken things could be made whole again if given time and care and patience. By summer, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt like partnership. Aaron started keeping clothes at her apartment, a toothbrush in the bathroom, coffee mugs he preferred. She had a key to his place, a renovated loft in an old factory building where he kept his tools and worked on small projects in the evenings. They didn't talk about moving in together officially. It just happened gradually, naturally, their lives interweaving until the separation between his space and hers became increasingly arbitrary. One Sunday in late June, Aaron suggested they plant a garden in the small patch of dirt behind the shop. Elena had never gardened before beyond working with cut flowers, had no idea what she was doing, but she agreed anyway. They spent the day on their knees in the dirt, Aaron patient and knowledgeable, teaching her about soil pH and drainage and which plants thrived in partial shade. They planted white carnations for his mother, red roses for passion and new beginnings, yellow daisies because they were cheerful, lavender for peace. Each flower a story, a memory, a hope. "My mom would have liked you," Aaron said as they worked, hands deep in earth, sun warm on their backs. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what happened to them but what they did after, how they got back up. You would have impressed her. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind that meant healing rather than breaking. "I wish I could have met her." "Me too. She would have told you embarrassing stories about me as a kid, shown you pictures of my awkward teenage years. Probably would have asked when we were getting married within 5 minutes of meeting you." The word hung in the air between them. Marriage. Elena's first instinct was panic, the old fear rising up like a wave, but underneath it, quieter but present, was something else. Curiosity, possibility, the understanding that marriage to Aaron would be nothing like marriage to Greg, that the word itself wasn't cursed, just the context she'd experienced it in before. Would that have bothered you? She asked carefully. Her asking that? Aaron sat back on his heels, considering. 6 months ago, yes. Now? He met her eyes. Now I think I'd tell her to be patient, that good things take time, that we're building something real, and real things can't be rushed. Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest, expanding and contracting simultaneously. I like that answer. They finished planting as the sun began to set, washing their hands with the garden hose, muddy and tired and content. Aaron pulled her close, uncaring about the dirt, and kissed her temple. Thank you, he said. For what? For letting me be part of this. Your life. Your garden. Your second chance. You're not part of my second chance, Elena said, pulling back to look at him directly. You are my second chance. That night, lying in bed in her apartment that had become their apartment in all but paperwork, Elena couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Aaron's steady breathing beside her, feeling his warmth, his solidity, his presence. She thought about who she'd been a year ago, the woman who'd lost everything in a single day, who'd spent nights in a cheap motel wishing she could simply stop existing, who'd taken a minimum wage job arranging flowers because it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. That woman felt like a stranger now, not forgotten, never forgotten. The pain of that time was still there, would always be there, a scar that had healed but would never fully fade. But she wasn't defined by it anymore, wasn't trapped in it. She'd built something new from the rubble, a business, a home, a relationship with someone who saw her completely and chose to stay anyway. She thought about Greg sometimes, less frequently as months passed, wondered if he ever thought about her, if he'd married Melissa, if he'd learned anything or simply found someone new to disappoint. It didn't matter, really. He was a chapter that had ended, not forgotten, but no longer being written. She hoped, in an abstract way, that he'd found some version of happiness, but mostly she just didn't think about him at all. Dorothy called once a week, checking on the shop, on Elena, on the garden. That boy of yours treating you right? She'd ask every time. He's not mine, Elena would protest half-heartedly. Oh, honey, Dorothy would laugh. He's been yours since the first time he brought you coffee. You're just finally figuring it out. Maybe she was right. Maybe Aaron had been hers all along. Fate or coincidence or simple human connection bringing them together at exactly the moment they both needed saving. Or maybe it didn't matter how it happened. Maybe what mattered was that it had. That they'd found each other in the wreckage. That they'd chosen to try despite every reason not to. That they were building something neither of them had believed possible. Elena turned onto her side, watching Aaron sleep, his face peaceful in the dim light filtering through the curtains. She reached out and touched his shoulder lightly, needing to confirm he was real. He stirred slightly, made a small sound, settled back into sleep, and Elena smiled, closed her eyes, and let herself fall into dreams that for the first time in her adult life didn't contain fear, just possibility, just hope, just the quiet certainty that tomorrow would come, and she would face it not alone, but accompanied, not broken, but healing, not ending, but beginning again and again and again. September arrived with the kind of golden light that made everything look painted, artificial in its perfection. Elena stood in the shop she now owned outright, final payment made just last week, and felt something close to peace settle in her chest. The morning rush had ended, leaving her alone with the flowers and the quiet hum of the cooler in her thoughts. She'd been thinking about something for weeks now, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She wanted to tell her story, not for sympathy or attention or validation, but because she kept thinking about all the women out there who might be sitting in motel rooms right now, or staring at ceilings in empty apartments, or trying to figure out how to survive when everything they'd built had been destroyed. She wanted them to know what she'd learned, that survival was possible, that pain didn't have to be permanent, that losing everything sometimes meant gaining the space to build something better. Dorothy had suggested she make a video for the shop's social media, something personal to help customers connect with the business. Elena had been resistant at first, private by nature and cautious about sharing pain publicly, but the idea had planted itself and grown, persistent as weeds, until she couldn't ignore it anymore. She set up her phone on a tripod Aaron had brought over, positioned it to capture her face and the flowers behind her, took a breath, started recording, stopped, started again, stopped. On the third try, she let the words come without overthinking them. "My name is Elena Hartfield," she began, voice steadier than she'd expected. "A year ago, I lost my job and my marriage on the same day. I found out my husband had been cheating on me with my best friend for 3 months. I lost my home, my career, my sense of who I was. I spent a week in a motel room wondering if the pain would ever stop, wondering if I'd ever feel human again." She paused, gathering courage to continue. Behind her, the flowers swayed slightly in the breeze from an open window. White carnations and roses and daisies, the garden Erin had helped her plant visible through the glass. "I'm making this video because I want you to know something if you're going through this right now. If you're sitting somewhere broken, wondering how you'll survive tomorrow, I want you to know that you will. Not because the pain goes away completely. It doesn't. But because you're stronger than you think. Because rock bottom, as awful as it is also solid ground. You can build from there." She felt tears but didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Kept talking. "I took a minimum wage job in a flower shop because it was the only thing I could find. I lived in a tiny apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking. I had panic attacks in grocery stores. I cried myself to sleep most nights. But I also got up every morning. I learned how to arrange flowers. I learned that small joys matter. Coffee brought by a kind person. The smell of lavender. The satisfaction of creating something beautiful. I learned that you don't have to have everything figured out to keep moving forward." Behind her, the shop bell chimed. Erin walked in, carrying lunch, and stopped when he saw she was recording. She gestured for him to come closer. He hesitated, then moved into frame, setting the food down, standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder. "This is Erin," Elena said, and her voice softened. "We met when I was at my lowest. He'd lost his mom. He'd been through divorce and betrayal too. He understood what it meant to be broken, and he showed me that broken people can heal each other, that trust isn't destroyed forever just because someone proved themselves unworthy of it. That love, real love, is patient and kind and shows up even when it's not asked to." Erin squeezed her shoulder gently. She covered his hand with hers. "I own this shop now. I have a home I chose. I have a relationship built on honesty and respect. I have a life I never imagined possible when I was lying in that motel room. Not because I'm special or particularly strong, but because I kept going, because I accepted help when it was offered. Because I let myself believe, slowly and cautiously, that maybe the story wasn't over, that maybe the worst thing that ever happened to me could become the doorway to the best thing." She looked directly at the camera, at the women she hoped would see this, who needed to hear it. "If you're in that dark place right now, please hear me. You are not alone. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not unlovable or insufficient or deserving of what happened to you. You are simply in the middle of your story, not the end. And the middle is always the hardest part, but it's also where the transformation happens, where you discover what you're made of, where you learn that you are enough, all by yourself, and anything else is just bonus." She took a breath, smiled through tears. "Keep going. Please keep going. Not because it will be easy, but because you deserve to see what's on the other side of this pain. And I promise you, it's worth the journey." Erin leaned down and kissed the top of her head, the gesture captured on camera, natural and unplanned and perfect. Elena reached up to stop the recording. Then she sat for a moment, looking at the frozen frame on her screen, seeing herself as others would see her. Whole, happy, healed, not perfectly, not completely, but substantially, unmistakably. She posted the video before she could second-guess herself, added a caption about the shop and second chances in the language of flowers. Then she set the phone down and turned to Erin. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For being patient. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For helping me build this life. You built this life," Erin corrected gently. "I just had the privilege of watching. And occasionally bringing coffee." She laughed, the sound genuine and light. They ate lunch in the back room, surrounded by the tools of her trade, talking about plans for the garden, about a house Erin was restoring, about whether they should get a dog. Normal conversations about a normal life that had been earned through survival and courage and the stubborn refusal to let betrayal define her. The video started getting responses within hours. Women thanking her, sharing their own stories, saying they needed to hear exactly this, exactly now. Elena read each comment with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that pain shared was somehow pain diminished, that her story could be medicine for someone else's wound. That evening, she and Aaron walked through their garden behind the shop, checking on flowers they'd planted together, pulling a few weeds, watering where the soil had gone dry. The sun set in brilliant oranges and pinks, painting the sky like a promise. The carnations were blooming white and perfect. The roses were thriving. The daisies created pools of yellow sunshine. I used to think the worst day of my life was losing everything, Elena said quietly, standing among the flowers with dirt under her fingernails and peace in her heart. But I was wrong. The worst day was just the day that cracked me open, made space for something new to grow. The pain was real, but so is this. So are you. So is everything we've built. Aaron pulled her close, and they stood there as darkness fell. Two people who'd been broken finding wholeness together, surrounded by flowers that bloomed despite the season, despite the odds, despite every reason they shouldn't. Living proof that endings were sometimes beginnings in disguise. That loss could clear the way for something better. That the greatest love stories often started not with fireworks, but with quiet kindness in flower shops on ordinary Fridays. And if you believe that second chances are real, that pain can transform into purpose, that the worst moments of your life might be preparing you for the best, then subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories of women who fell and rose, who lost and found, who discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what truly matters, because these stories need to be told, and someone out there, sitting in her own darkness, needs to hear that the light is coming, that healing is possible, that love, real love, is worth the risk of trying again.